Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Transcendent Philosophy. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Today, we're going to go into consciousness, one of the most mysterious topics of all, yet foundational to philosophy and morality and daily living in many ways. I used to be a very devout theist, and I always took for granted consciousness as just some magical spiritual phenomenon. God created me, God gave me a spirit, and what I was experiencing on a daily basis was just merely the phenomenon that God created, and that was me. I was that entity of consciousness that I interpreted as spirit, supernatural stuff. And I took that for granted for a long time. But over the years, I encountered different things, I learned different things, and I experienced different things that caused me to slowly question my entire paradigm. And so I slowly lost my faith, became agnostic, and then I went through this transition phase where I was like, if this whole spiritual stuff, if that's kind of iffy, what the hell is going on in my head? I have this crazy world of thoughts, sensations, colors, sounds, all of these crazy phenomenon are happening in my head and in my body. If it's not a spirit, what exactly is going on? So in many ways, I felt like I kind of had to rebuild my understanding of the world. I had to relearn so many different things, and consciousness was something that really bothered me because it was so mysterious, and I felt like I really needed to understand it. And so I've been exploring it, trying to figure it out, listening to all sorts of lectures and reading different material that I can get my hands on. And so I've kind of aggregated a lot of different thoughts in my journey on this issue. And so today I'm going to share them with you and see what you think. Okay, so when it comes to the philosophy of consciousness, there's the easy problem and the hard problem. I'm assuming people that are interested in my channel probably already know this, but I'll try to review it really quickly. The easy problem with consciousness is basically neural correlates. If you know anything about neuroscience, they're looking at brain patterns and then behaviors. And there's a matchup. So it's like, oh, if we stimulate this part of your brain, you're going to move your arm. And so that's a neural correlate. It's this part of the brain, if stimulated, triggers this behavior. Therefore, we know there's a connection between this part of the brain and this behavior. Same thing with patterns. If we see this pattern, it means language is being processed. If we see this pattern, it means color or visual information is being processed. So they can kind of do this pairing, this correlation. And they can, with correlations, they can make predictions. So they can have a scientifically valid empiricism. We can make a prediction. We put you in the machine. We scan your brain. Our prediction is validated. We know how to correlate the brain signals. So the easy problem is trying to figure out how to correlate everything. So in addition to the easy problem of consciousness, there is the hard problem of consciousness. To me, this is the most fascinating, most mysterious, most difficult problem that I'm just itching to figure this one out. So the hard problem of consciousness was formulated by David Chalmers, a philosopher, and I believe he's from Arizona, the same state that I'm from, so that's kind of cool. But today, to start off, we're going to go through this page right here, which is formations of the hard problem of consciousness. So I guess there's different ways to state the hard problem, and it's kind of confusing to kind of wrap your head around what exactly this problem is. And so I think by stating it multiple ways, it'll kind of attack the problem from different angles, and it might make it easier to grasp the breadth of this problem. So, as David Chalmers says here, the hard problem of consciousness is the problem of explaining the relationship between physical phenomena, such as brain processes, and experience, i.e., phenomenal consciousness, or mental states or events that have phenomenal qualities, or qualia. So phenomenology, phenomenal consciousness, qualia, what that's talking about, it's the sensations, right? There's a difference between an electric signal in your brain and feelings, right? So it's the gap, the relationship between this physical electrical signal in the brain and a feeling. Cognitively, those are two different things, because you can have an electric signal in a machine, but we don't think that that's equivalent to a feeling. But in our brain, it kind of seems like there's a very tight relationship between these electric signals, and somehow there's a feeling there. And so there's a problem in explaining the relationship. Why is an electric signal making a feeling? It seems like two different things. So then there's some questions he poses right after this. Why are physical processes ever accompanied by experience, right? Why does a given physical process generate the specific experience it does? Why an experience of red rather than green, for example? So you've got you could have a little brain signal. It's like a zigzag, and this zigzag makes the color red, but then a different zigzag makes the color green. It's like, why in the hell is the shape of a zigzag changing it from red to green? That they seem completely different phenomena, yet due to neuroscience, it's the data we're getting from neuroscience, it kind of seems like they're equivalent, but that doesn't make sense. And so the hard problem of consciousness is trying to get this to make sense. Additionally, a quote by Mark Solm: "Why and how is there something it is like to be an organism? Something it is like for the organism." So this quote, it's something it is like to be an organism. That likeness, it's pointing to the same thing: consciousness, feelings, sensations. Why do organisms have this thing? So this is a quote by myself: "If you don't know what the building blocks of consciousness are, then you have no authority to say which objects have consciousness and which don't." Right? So if consciousness is any and all electrical signals, then that presents an interesting proposition. That means computers have consciousness because they have electric signals. Maybe lightning has consciousness, because there's, if you don't know what's the difference between the brain and a computer, then you can't say that one has consciousness and the other doesn't. So the hard problem of consciousness is trying to figure out what these building blocks are, so we know exactly what has consciousness and what doesn't, because we know the how and the why behind consciousness. In a sense, the hard problem of consciousness is very connected to the ability to engineer consciousness, right? If we know the hows and the whys and the building blocks of consciousness, then we could probably engineer it within a machine. So the test, the ultimate proof that we understand the hard problem of consciousness is being able to engineer it. Another quote by myself here: "This gap between collisions and consciousness is the issue highlighted by the hard problem of consciousness." Collisions and consciousness. The gap between collisions and consciousness. We're going to go into this more later, but just to clarify, collisions is, I'm referring to neurotransmitters, right? In neuronal connections, there's neurotransmitters that collide into a synapse, and then, so people talk about dopamine. Dopamine gives you pleasure. Well, dopamine is a neurotransmitter that collides into a synapse, into a receptor, and then somehow feelings come out of collisions. So, understanding why collisions produce consciousness, that's the gap there. As I continue, there's nothing normal about one set of atoms colliding with another set of atoms to magically produce feelings. Are feelings located in the atoms at the source of the collision, or are feelings located in a higher order self that is floating around? How are these feelings transported from the atom to the higher order self? Why does one set of atoms produce one feeling and another set of atoms produce another feeling? So a series of questions attacking this how and why question from different angles. Another quote here from me: "In the binary code of a computer, 10001110 is passed around to signify the color red. Yet nothing about this information conveys the essence of what it feels like to perceive the color red. If you told me that an AI algorithm is constantly perceiving the color red every time 10001110 is passed around, I would think you're insane, because I don't see a connection between ones and zeros and color. Yet, when we replace ones and zeros with molecular configurations of atoms and neurotransmitters, suddenly people are willing to accept that configurations of atoms can produce the qualia of redness. And to append to this, maybe people don't accept that consciousness comes from neurotransmitters. Maybe they think it's brain patterns. The same thing applies, right? What makes you think the brain pattern is equivalent to qualia of redness? Because I don't think that an electric pattern in a machine is the same as redness. It's just not intuitive. Another quote by me. To me, the hard problem of consciousness is basically the idea that we have physical facts, for example, neurotransmitters that collide into a neuron, and these physical facts magically produce mental facts, or facts of consciousness, like the qualia of redness. Materialist dualism is basically the recognition that these collisions have two properties: physical properties and mental properties. Physical or qualia. Physical and qualia. Qualia is just an easier word for properties of consciousness. It's just the sensations, the feelings. That's what we're just getting at here. Another quote by yours truly: "Please explain how unconsciously dead materials or energy suddenly come alive and summon an infinitely rich variety of immaterial conscious qualia, whose characteristics seem to have nothing to do with the material or energy involved." So that's the deadness of the material world is part of the conundrum. We see rocks, we see dust, and we see metal. It just seems dead to us, inert, no personality, no feeling. That's what our intuitions tell us about these materials. But if you take these material, carbon, right? You take carbon and nitrogen, and you organize them into our brains, and suddenly these materials that were formerly dead are now alive, experiencing rich conscious experiences. That transition is so it's basically the transition from dead to alive in terms of consciousness, which is the another way to state the hard problem. Continuing here is an analogy. It's like aggregating rocks, and then a visible ghost is produced from these rocks. And the more rocks you gather, the more visually impressive the ghost that appears above the rocks. But the attributes of this ghost seem to have nothing to do with the rocks gathered. The transition from rocks to ghosts becomes quite confusing. Similarly, the transition from atoms to emotions, feelings, and qualia, it's so weird that it bothers people like me. So just to make sure this is clear, evolution is the process of aggregating and piling up rocks, right? You get one rock, two rocks, you make a big rock pile, and that's the analogy is that's the process of evolution. We're building a biological creature, and this creature has all these rock-like materials, dead materials. But this ghost, that's the consciousness, right? This consciousness, it just appears as we gather these rocks. And then the consciousness gets more and more impressive. So you gather the rocks into the shape of a frog, gather the rocks into the shape of a dog. Well, the dog's ghost is more impressive than the frog. But then we gather it and make a human, and the human's ghost is way more impressive than the dog's ghost. But like we can see this pattern and we say, oh, so it seems like evolution is producing consciousness. Oh, sure, fine. Maybe consciousness is just emergent natural phenomenon. I accept. But I still don't understand how these dead materials are making this ghost-like thing. All right, now we're going to go into the cosmic consciousness analogy of the hard problem of consciousness. This is an analogy I came up with to see if this analogy can help elucidate what at least one angle of this problem is. So as you can see from this image, we've got a human brain and we've got the cosmos. We've got a zoom in on neuronal connections, and we've got a zoom in on a solar system. And then we've got another zoom in on the synapses that are taking in the P substance for pain, a neuroreceptor, a large neurotransmitter that creates the pain sensation. And we've got dopamine here that creates the pleasure sensation upon impact or reception by the receptor on these neuronal synapses. And analogously, we've got a comet, or an asteroid and a comet over here, a fireball and an ice ball. And when it's just, when the asteroid hits Earth, the analogy is, oh, pain appears. And when the comet hits Mars, pleasure appears. I'm sorry I'm laughing, but this is the point of the analogy. The point of the analogy is to show how absurd this sounds. It sounds so absurd that like maybe there's this cosmic consciousness, right? There's this self. There's this, the galaxy has a self that's floating around. And every time the Earth is hit by a fireball, the self of the galaxy goes, ouch. And every time Mars is hit by a comet, the galaxy is like, ooh, that felt good. It's utterly absurd because, well, I'll get into the because, but as it says here, the hard problem of consciousness. Why do some collisions generate consciousness but not others? Why are these collisions making feelings but not these collisions, right? I think that a helpful example of the hard problem of consciousness is what I call the cosmic consciousness analogy. Hopefully it's helpful. Imagine there was a religion that claimed that every time a comet strikes the Earth, the universe feels pain, sadness, or fear. Maybe the style of negative feeling changes based on which continent it strikes. Maybe, America is pain and Africa is sadness, Europe is fear. Yeah, it's a negative feeling, but different flavors based on the continent. Also, every time a meteor strikes Mars, the universe feels joy, hope, excitement, and pleasure, depending on which area of Mars is struck. This proposition should strike the skeptic as quite implausible, since 1. There is no evidence that the universe has a conscious mind capable of feeling emotions. 2. There's no functional explanation for where this cosmic mind would reside. 3. there's no functional connection between the collision of space rocks and this cosmic consciousness. 4, there's no logical explanation for why different types of collisions produce drastically different feelings for the universe, often of polar opposite natures. 5, there's no logical reason for why the universe would need to experience these feelings. The gap between collisions and consciousness is the issue, or at least one of the issues, highlighted by the hard problem of consciousness. When cosmic collisions are invoked, we would not assume that those collisions necessarily produce consciousness. Yet, when neurotransmitters collide with neurons in the brain, some people don't even bat an eye, and they think that it's normal to expect feelings to arise from these phenomena. To me, there's nothing normal about one set of atoms colliding with another set of atoms to magically produce feelings. Are the feelings located in the atoms at the source of the collision, or are they located in the higher order self floating around? Right? I've gone over this already, but how are these feelings transported to that higher order self? Why does one set of atoms produce one feeling and another set of atoms produce another feeling? Are hydrogen and oxygen atoms constantly feeling pain in half of their collisions? And then maybe in another half of their collisions they're feeling pleasure? And do these atomic feelings somehow bubble up into bigger feelings and organize up through the neurotransmitter interactions? And so if we take these collisions seriously, is flowing water a sea of emotions just because of all these atomic collisions, hydrogens and oxygens bouncing and banging and flinging against each other? Is there just spasmic emotions all over the place in a river? Is that what we're supposed to conclude and deduce from this line of reasoning? To me, it would seem quite absurd to assume that collisions naturally produce feelings. But this seems to be one of the conclusions that we're forced to accept by the existence of consciousness in the brain. The mere fact that we know consciousness exists forces us to conclude the absurd. It was like something very counterintuitive is producing these phenomena. We have reason to believe that feelings are constructed for certain motivational purposes. Ideally, an organism must run an image processing algorithm on visual data, and then simultaneously run an audio processing algorithm, and then compare and contrast the results of these different algorithms against the data in the organism's memory in order to identify certain objects in their environment based on their historical experience. Then they need to check the object that they identified against a threat or opportunity function to see if this is a good object or a bad object. Only after all of these calculations are done can an organism appropriately activate the feeling of fear or excitement, depending on if it's a good or a bad object. So theoretically, the purpose of feelings is to provide us with an intelligent motivation. This intelligent motivation is a type of utility or benefit to the creature, helping it survive and thrive by making better decisions, right? If you see a lion in the brush and you get excited and you walk towards it, you're going to die. But if you calculate the lion and then you produce fear, you're going to run away and maybe survive. And so doing a proper calculation and producing the correct qualia, it seems evolutionarily necessary. But a conclusion that seems very derivable from this evolutionary line of reasoning is that if this is the function of consciousness, it would seem that consciousness is engineered by evolution, which means that the hard problem of consciousness has an answer. There is a way to engineer consciousness. It's not just a mysterious thing. So there's got to be a way to figure out, like, how do we engineer fear? How do we engineer excitement? Like, what is the atomic or the most foundational units that need to be produced to engineer these feelings? It should be solvable. But there's no reason to believe that biological creatures need intelligent feelings in order to make good decisions. We make many intelligent decisions unconsciously. Based on my limited perspective, there is no reason why we can't make all intelligent decisions unconsciously. This is the philosophic zombie argument. The phenomenon of blind sight is evidence for this. Blind sight occurs when the channel between the visual cortex and consciousness, or the self, is severed. Yet this channel between the visual cortex and the subconscious remains intact. What occurs is the astounding phenomenon of people who claim to be blind, right? Their conscious self claims that they can't experience color or vision. But so they don't have the qualia of vision, but when you ask them about the nature of objects in their visual space, they are able to correctly answer those visual questions when you push them to give a guess based on their gut feel. So you're blind, you can't see anything, and they say, where is the dog? And you say, oh, the dog's over there. If you're guessing that right, it means that unconsciously you know where the dog is, but consciously you can't see the dog. So what that means is that the unconscious can do the decisions. We don't need this conscious feeling because our unconscious calculations are good enough. So hypothetically, you could have conscious feelings or unconscious decisions, right? But if we evolve from evolution, which we do, either all of our decisions need to be optimal to give us the maximum utility. Like, it doesn't matter if we do unconscious decisions or conscious decisions. We need to make our decisions in a smart way that helps us survive and reproduce. We know that we have conscious feelings, but based on the evolutionary argument, we know that these conscious feelings need to give us utility. And what that means is that we cannot, like the structure of our consciousness, it can't be based on random sensations. They have to be intelligent sensations, which means those sensations need to be designed intelligently. And what that means is that feelings can't be the result of arbitrary collisions, right? The whole river, the river is a cesspool of feelings. We can't be like a river. We can't just be random feelings. We have to be intelligently designed feelings, the meticulous result of intentional processes or algorithms. If random feelings are the result of random collisions, then we can't use those random feelings intelligently. In order to survive and thrive, we need to be able to biologically trigger feelings in an intelligent way. This means that only certain collisions are able to produce feelings, and we can biologically control when these certain collisions activate. Further, in order to have a level of nuance in our feelings, we must be able to combine different elemental feelings into more complex feelings. This means that there is an architecture to our feelings. But knowing that we need an intelligent architect to construct our feelings doesn't explain how collisions are able to become the building blocks or the bricks of this architected experience. The problem is, from a materialistic standpoint, the brain is just atoms moving around deterministically. Perhaps certain algorithms of matter movement in the brain produce intelligence, just like certain algorithms of matter movement in machines produce AI intelligence. But in the machine, at no point does electrons moving around produce a deep, rich world of powerful sensations. Or at least, that's our assumption. When AI processes colors, it is just ones and zeros moving around. The sensation of the color red is, assumably, never comprehended. Why is it that when atoms move around in our head, suddenly sensations appear? Nothing in the atoms or molecules gives us the idea that they have the capacity for consciousness. At least, nothing like ours. Nothing about atoms seems like it has the ability to communicate feelings. Yet somehow, instead of us being unconscious zombies that deterministically operate against our brain algorithms, suddenly we are awake, processing the feeling of the information in our brains. Like, in the world, colors don't exist. Colors are just frequencies of energy. A frequency of energy, that's just a shape, right? This energy is the ability to do work, like it's just power. This energy is moving through space, and it moves in a certain shape, frequency. That's not a color. The noumena, the thing in and of itself, as Kant would say, it's not a color. It's just energy. So it seems like there is no redness in the external world. Redness is just invented by our brains. The phenomena of color is engineered by our brains. It's not pulled in from the external world. But based on my very limited understanding of neuroscience, if you look at how the brain works, redness as a phenomena, as a color, as a qualia, it's not communicated at any point in the neurology. When red frequency light hits your eyes, it merely performs a chemical reaction with the atoms in your eye that are sensitive to red frequencies. There's a receptor, and the receptor, gets activated by the red photon, and it absorbs it and triggers an electrical signal. That's an energy exchange. It's absorbing the energy and sending, So the molecules reorganize their pattern in the face of a certain frequency. Perhaps certain parts of your eye are able to absorb the energy from red light. So a bunch of electrons in your eye get energized by absorbing this red light. Absorbing the red light doesn't mean the atoms doing the absorbing are experiencing the color red. Theoretically, at least. It seems very unusual to say that the atom experiences redness, but yeah, maybe that's how it works. We know that your brain performs many calculations before it allows you to see color, like I just said, and visual illusions are evidence. Like there's so many procedures that the brain is doing. To me, it doesn't seem like qualia is the first thing that happens. It seems like qualia is built up. It aggregates the data and then it builds the qualia instead of just getting the qualia immediately upon absorption. So the atoms that are absorbing the photon, right? You got the receptor, takes in the red photon, and then the molecules and the atoms, it absorbs, the electrons are energized, and the electron that gets energized, it steals the energy from the photon. And so now you've got a really energized electron, and that's moving around, and that creates a signal. Where's the redness? Where is the color? Where is the sensation of redness? That's just an energy transaction. That's all that is. Your eye passes the energy from the energized electrons in your eye down a chain of reactions, and it stimulates the visual cortex in the back of your brain for processing. The visual cortex is in the back of your brain. So it's like there's all of this processing before you get like your vision, because the vision is in the back of your brain. So that's further evidence that it's algorithmic. It's not a priori just default qualia. It's the information gets processed, and then you get this vision cortex at the back of your brain that your eye has to flip the qualia upside down. Everything you see is upside down, and then your visual cortex flips it right side up. So that's just further evidence that it's algorithmic. It's not just an innate qualia thing. So perhaps the eye is energized, and the eye sends energy to the neurons, and the neurons pass it down a chain of neurons, and then the visual cortex finally absorbs the energy that came from the eye. And then the visual cortex processes that energy. What is being processed? So I don't know, a collection of atoms in the form of a neurotransmitter? Because that's usually the transaction that happens from atom to atom, right? A bunch of neurotransmitters, they escape the synapse, and then they jump over to another synapse, and they get processed into another neuron. And that it creates a chain of energy. So that these neurotransmitters are largely just oxygen and hydrogen, which is exactly what water is. So we're back to the absurdity of a river. It was like, if oxygen and hydrogen moving around creates sensation, then maybe rivers are full of sensations. Again, it's just mere energy transfers and chemical reactions and, receptors and synapses, electric potentials, neurotransmitter bindings, flow of electricity, electrical patterns, signals. I don't see redness anywhere in these processes. But we know it appears somewhere in these processes because we feel it. And back to the philosophic zombie argument, the blindside argument. Technically, we don't even need to have awareness of redness. We don't even need the feeling or sensation of redness. Theoretically, we can function perfectly successfully as meat machines without ever feeling the essence of redness. Our algorithms can trigger fear in the face of redness without needing to comprehend its pseudo-essence. We can react unconsciously to experiences just like robots act unconsciously in the face of danger detected by its algorithms. 95% of our behavior is already unconscious. Why are we actually conscious of 5%? Why do we feel sensations when it's mere atoms moving around? And to elucidate a little bit more on the binary code analogy, in a computer, in software, 10001110 is passed around to signify the color red. This information is completely arbitrary, by the way, because in software coding, you can basically define it however you like, because it's going to algorithmically produce red later. It's just an identity that's irrelevant to the redness initially. But that is the signal that gets passed around. So the key point here is that nothing about this signal, this 100 signal, nothing about that conveys the essence of what it feels like to perceive the color red. It just doesn't. It's arbitrary. You could change the numbers up all you want. There's nothing about one number set that's red and another number set that's green, because the number set doesn't include greenness or redness or whatever. So if you told me that AI algorithms were consciously perceiving the color red every time 100110 is passed around, I would think that you might be insane. But when we replace the ones and zeros with molecular configurations of atoms and neurotransmitters and electric signals and configurations of energy patterns, suddenly people are willing to accept that configurations of atoms can produce the quality of redness. If something as benign as color can't be explained, how do you explain pain, pleasure, love, hate, sound, taste, smell, and all the other varieties of sensations? Music. What if we evolved to get a new sensation? How can that be achieved? What if we wanted to evolve to see X-rays? What color would X-rays be? What if you wanted to invent a new color for a new category of sensation? What atomic configuration is going to get you that new color? What if we wanted to be bats and have echolocation? Why not see sound and color? There are people that have the ability to see sound and color. They've got a mutation that converts audio signals into color. So it's not impossible, but how the hell does it work? Computers have sensors. They can use cameras to analyze colors and objects and process behavioral responses to visual stimuli. For example, self-driving cars. Yet, never in this analysis of visual stimuli do they actually feel the stimuli. They merely convert the stimuli into numbers for processing. I don't find any reasonable argument for how consciousness can emerge merely from complexity, because software can be very complex, yet there's no justification for saying that it has conscious feelings. So when we're talking about phenomena, the principle of emergence is usually used to explain how phenomena arise. And emergence, like we could expect that the natural emergence of a phenomena would make sense if there are natural forces that create a systemic result. Like with evolution, we've got the natural forces of selection that are creating a systemic result, which is mutations are systemically getting better and better, and that gives us a better creature. So we can explain the phenomena of better creatures by this system of evolution. But consciousness is such an extreme phenomena that I don't understand how electromagnetic forces between brain cells can produce it without imputing a panpsychic consciousness to energy in general. But that panpsychism, it seems absurd. Panpsychism is, saying that atoms have consciousness. Consciousness seems like a higher order phenomenon than that which can be expected from its constituent parts. Life as brain-dead zombie automatons would make much more sense to me as an emergent phenomena of the organization of dead matter. Consciousness is one step beyond mindless automation. It does not make sense to me that consciousness is just naturally emerging from dead materials that organize. To me, saying that consciousness emerges from the organization of atoms is as absurd as saying that God emerges out of the organization of energy. The problem is that we have evidence of consciousness, so I'm left to being utterly bewildered by how this thing comes about. But it's obvious that consciousness does come from the benign processes of the brain. This is a quote by Donald Hoffman. "We literally cut consciousness in half with a knife. You can create entirely separate units of consciousness between the two hemispheres of the brain. The right hemisphere can be aware of the word key, and the left hemisphere is aware of the word ring, yet neither hemisphere is aware of the word key ring. We find that the personalities are different. The right hemisphere often has a different personality from the left. In one study, the left hemisphere believed in God, while the right hemisphere was an atheist. The left hemisphere likes to generate stories. The right hemisphere seems to be more in tune with reality and a little less happy." Neuroscience shows that consciousness is definitely dependent on brains. Panpsychists usually believe that all matter has consciousness, but I don't find this argument very intuitive. Using your own body as an experimental test subject, you can know that parts of your body are more conscious than others. Your skin, your eyes, your ears, your brain, and injuries are often very active within your consciousness. They're very conscious, these parts of your body. But your muscles, your joints, your lungs, your heart, your intestines, and your stomach are very minorly active within your consciousness. You don't have a ton of awareness of these parts of your body. Your senses, when stimulated, are very conscious. But your hair, your fingernails, your kidneys, your bones, they're just not conscious. You don't have any awareness inside your hair or your fingernails. And your individual cells are not individually conscious. When you cut off a limb or a piece of skin, all of that material loses its consciousness by becoming disconnected from your brain via the nerves. So we can infer that consciousness is dependent on a connection to the brain and stimulation along that connection. The reason why fingernails don't hurt when we clip them off is because they don't have a connection to the brain. There's no nerves in your fingernail. Same thing with your hair. We can also infer that the more similar a nervous system is to our own nervous system, the more similar their conscious experience. Yet with AI software, we have no evidence to say that they are conscious, since nothing about their structure even remotely resembles our nervous system. The information integration theory of consciousness posits that consciousness comes merely from complex integrations of information, and hence, perhaps AI can become conscious merely by becoming complex. But this seems wrong, since we can remove complexity from the brain damage and surgery, for example, but the brain is still conscious. The entire cortex can even be removed. So the cortex of the brain, like the visual chunks of the brain, that's the entire cortex, is like what you think of as a brain. You can remove all of that and you're still conscious. So you basically don't need your brain to be conscious, except the brainstem. The brainstem has to stay. Also, when we are asleep, we lose consciousness, yet we maintain the same or similar levels of complexity in brain activity. That might be debatable, but the brain is very active during sleep, and so activity is definitely still there. Number 3, certain areas of the brain have large amounts of complexity, yet they have zero impact on consciousness. For example, the cerebellum. The cerebellum is a unique structure in the back of the brain, and they've correlated the cerebellum to high precision movements. You could think of it like a physics engine of the brain. If you want to have very detailed calculations for movement, you need the cerebellum. But it's not conscious. It's a very large part of the brain. It has a large amount of neurons. It has a large amount of connections, large amount of complexity, but it has 0% consciousness within this structure of the brain. There's another theory about consciousness that is thinking of consciousness as a general workspace. The idea behind it being an intentional emergent phenomenon. So like consciousness is constructed because of the utility of using consciousness as a workspace to like drop information and work on the information and move it around, right? They think there's like utility to have this slot called consciousness as a place for the brain to produce and send information to and from. This general workspace hypothesis, it kind of views the brain as having a little man, a homunculus, inside, and this little man is acting as an agent to receive all of the information, and then that little man makes a decision and like sends the conclusions out and away from the workspace. Clinical neurologist Stephen Novella believes that this theory has been debunked after many years of effort to try to identify the location of this agent or the location of this workspace. The resulting conclusion is that there is no central agent, but rather the entire brain functions like a committee, each part contributing an aspect to this net consciousness. So consciousness is obviously a complex phenomena that has multiple different features, right? Different types of qualia are different features of consciousness. But fundamentally, consciousness is just awareness. It's the qualia of awareness. It's the feeling of awareness. And you can be aware of lots of different types of things. You can be aware of sound. You can be aware of pleasure. You can be aware of selfness, right? But in order to not have consciousness, all of your awareness has to be turned off. There has to be no awareness. And so, in a sense, consciousness can be analogous to a light switch or a light that has a dimmer switch, where you can have zero consciousness, which is the lights off, and you can kind of have dim consciousness where you have a little bit of awareness, and then you can expand the brightness of that consciousness to get more features to that consciousness. So if the workspace analogy is debunked, if consciousness is coming from every part of the brain with different features coming from different circuits or cortexes of the brain, when we treat patients with all types of brain damage, neuropsychologist Mark Solms claims to have found the place in the brain where, if damaged, the lights of consciousness go off. The root of consciousness seems to be within the brainstem, specifically the reticular activating system. Perhaps complex conscious experience is produced via the interaction between algorithms in the cortex and the feeling generation within the brainstem. But merely locating the source of the light switch still doesn't really tell us the problem, but perhaps it gives us a really good clue as to what we need to zoom in on and look into deeper to figure this out. Perhaps if we can figure out how the brainstem works, that will solve the hard problem of consciousness. The most interesting argument for explaining the hard problem of consciousness that I have come across, so far at least, is the argument for the geometry of consciousness. In the Neural Manifolds video, they make an argument for how the shape of the network of stimulated neurons is designing the feeling. For example, in simple terms, they argue that a circular structure of neurons in the brain is responsible for a rat's understanding of the 360 degrees of space around them. Based on this circular structure of neurons, whichever neuron is stimulated within the circle, that is the direction the rat is facing. If the neuron at 0 degrees is active, the rat feels like they are facing north. If the neuron at 90 degrees is active, they feel like they are facing east. If the neuron at 180 degrees is active, they feel like they are facing south. If the neuron at 270 degrees is active, they feel like they are facing west. This argument implies that some conscious agent within us is able to feel the shape of electricity in our brains. This is a fascinating explanation, but I don't think it fully explains where this agent comes from, why electricity is feelable in the first place, and how electricity can be adapted to a large array of different types of feelings, both good and bad. But this is a very interesting direction to pursue in further answering questions about consciousness, studying the geometry of how these brain patterns are shaped. So, does the hard problem of consciousness philosophically force us into a corner? Are we obligated to choose between irrational dualism and absurd panpsychism? By irrational dualism, I mean the idea of dead material and alive spirit. Like, do we have to accept that there's this magical substance that makes us alive? Or do we have to accept the absurd conclusion of panpsychism, which is that everything is conscious, that every dirt molecule, every rock, even our fingernails have their own consciousness? It just seems absurd. So, are we forced to choose between one of these options? Is it really reasonable to assume that chemical reactions, or electric potentials, or neurotransmitter bindings can produce consciousness? If we make such assumptions, are we forced to admit that all chemical reactions, all electric potentials, all neurotransmitter bindings produce consciousness? Doesn't this have remarkable ethical implications? Is a chemistry lab also a torture chamber for all of the molecules involved? Or how can we know which types of physical phenomena produce which types of conscious phenomena? I hope that we can get more answers about the nature of consciousness in the coming years. For more information on some of the things that I've cited here, I've learned from a variety of videos. So you can check out these videos here for more information.